The blade was already at Ophelia Marwood's throat when the vampire court fell silent, not the polite silence of ceremony, not the hush of aristocratic decorum. This was the silence of 300 immortal creatures collectively holding breath they did not need. Every ancient eye fixed on the human woman standing at the center of the obsidian floor, with iron manacles around her wrists and a curved silver blade pressed against the pale column of her neck. Ophelia did not flinch. She stood with her spine straight and her dark eyes steady, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, because they had taken the pins when they had taken her freedom, and she stared across the vast chamber at the vampire, holding the knife with an expression that could only be described as profoundly unimpressed. "You realize," she said, her voice carrying without a tremor to every corner of the high-ceilinged hall, "that killing me will not save you. It will only confirm that every accusation Lord Varys has leveled against this court is absolutely true." The vampire holding the blade was not Varys. He was a creature called Mordecai, the High Steward of the Dunraven Court, and his white hair fell in careful waves over a brocade jacket that probably cost more than Ophelia's entire apartment in London. His pale lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "The human speaks," he said, addressing the assembled court rather than her, making her into a spectacle rather than a person. "How charming. How entirely irrelevant. Where is he?" Ophelia said. That was the question that cracked the silence wider, because everyone in this room knew who she meant, and everyone in this room had spent the last 6 hours pretending they did not know the answer. "His Majesty is indisposed," Mordecai said smoothly. "His Majesty," Ophelia said, "is poisoned, and you know it, and I know it. And the only reason this blade is at my throat instead of yours is because you need me silent before I can tell anyone how to reverse it." The silence shifted. It became something heavier and more dangerous, and for the first time, the assembled lords and ladies of the Dunraven Court looked at each other rather than at her, and in those exchanged glances, Ophelia read the fracture lines of a court that was not unified in its betrayal. She had 3 minutes, maybe less. She needed to use them, but to explain why Ophelia Marwood, a 28-year-old archival researcher from southeast London, was standing in the hidden court beneath the city with a silver blade at her throat and the knowledge to save a vampire king, you had to go back 6 weeks, to a night in the rain and a wrong turn and a door that should not have existed. The archive where Ophelia worked occupied the upper floors of a building in Holborn that had been a private library in the 19th century, and a printing house before that, and something considerably older before that. She specialized in pre-modern European manuscripts, specifically those written in obscure or cipher languages, and she was very good at her job. And she had no idea that 3 of her colleagues were vampires, until the evening she stayed too late cross-referencing a 7th century Lombardic text, and walked into the basement looking for the printer and found instead a conversation that was never meant for human ears. She had not screamed. That was perhaps the most significant thing about Ophelia Marwood, the quality that would eventually change everything. When confronted with the impossible, she did not scream. She assessed. 2 of her colleagues she had recognized immediately, Dr. Petra Vane and the tall cataloguer called Silas, who never gave his last name. The third was someone she had never seen before, which, given that he occupied the center of the room the way a gravity well-occupied space, was difficult to explain. He was tall. He was pale in the way that architectural marble was pale, with white hair pulled back from a face of such severe and perfect angles that for a moment Ophelia genuinely thought he was a statue. Except statues did not turn their heads and meet your eyes across a dim basement with an expression of complete and terrible focus. He had looked at her the way a person looks at a flame in a dark room, drawn and dangerous at once. "Hello," Ophelia had said, "and Balthazar Dunraven, king of the northern vampire courts, sovereign of the Old Blood Compact, creature of 400 years of ruthless survival and immortal political calculation, had said very quietly, 'Hello.' Petra had moved immediately, positioning herself between Ophelia and the king, and Silas had crossed the room in a single inhuman blur of speed that made Ophelia's stomach drop. And then they had stood there in a triangle around her, while the king studied her with those pale grey eyes that seemed to catch light from a source she could not identify. "She should not have heard that," Silas said. "No," the king agreed. What is your name? Ophelia Marwood. I work upstairs. I was looking for the printer. She paused. I am gathering from the lack of printer and the general atmosphere that this is not about a printer. The king's expression shifted. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and it transformed his face from terrifying to something that made entirely different categories of alarm go off in Ophelia's nervous system. No, he said. It is not about a printer. Are you going to kill me? No. Erase my memory. I am considering it. I would prefer you did not, Ophelia said. I find memory erasure ethically troubling, and I expect I would find it practically troubling as well. Given that I would presumably continue working here without understanding why my recall of the last hour is compromised. I am very good at noticing gaps in things. Balthazar looked at Petra. Petra looked back at him with an expression that said, Very clearly I told you she was unusual. What followed was the strangest negotiation of Ophelia's professional life, conducted in the basement of an archive at 10:30 on a Tuesday evening, which ended with Ophelia agreeing to discretion in exchange for the king not erasing her memory, and which also ended with Balthazar Dunraven leaning against a shelf of uncatalogued Victorian tax records and asking her, with what she could only describe as genuine curiosity, what exactly she had been working on upstairs. She had told him. He had asked a question. She had answered it. He had asked another question. And the conversation had spiraled outward from 7th century Lombardic manuscripts into the broader question of pre-modern European record-keeping traditions, and then into the specific challenges of deciphering coded administrative texts. And it had been an hour before either of them noticed that Petra and Silas had quietly left the room. He had come back the next night. He had not announced himself. He had simply appeared in the archive at 9:30 and settled into the chair across from her work table as if he had always sat there, and he had said, You mentioned last night that you believed there was a second layer of encoding in the Lombardic text. I would like to hear your reasoning, and so it had begun, 6 evenings across 3 weeks, always after dark, always in the quiet of the archive where the old building breathed around them, and the city hummed distantly outside, and the manuscripts spread between them like bridges between centuries. He was brilliant. That was the first thing she had understood about him, beyond his physicality, beyond the supernatural presence that made the air around him feel different, charged, and still at once. He was genuinely, seriously brilliant, with the kind of mind that 400 years of existence had sharpened to an edge that cut through complexity, the way a blade cuts through silk, smooth and precise and almost effortless. He also, she had noticed, watched her constantly. Not with predatory focus, or at least not purely with predatory focus. It was more like the way a person watches something they find endlessly interesting and are simultaneously afraid of losing. She had caught it in her peripheral vision a dozen times, that pale gaze tracking her when he thought she was not paying attention, and she had filed it away without comment because it seemed like exactly the kind of observation that would make things complicated. Things became complicated anyway. It was the 4th evening when he had arrived to find her sitting at her work table, with a map spread across it, and 3 reference texts open, and a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. Working through a problem she had been circling for days, and he had sat down and looked at the map and said, You have solved it. Almost, she said. The secondary encoding uses the feast calendar, he said. Not the administrative one, the ecclesiastical one. That is why the numbers do not align with any standard dating system. They are counting forward from Candlemas. She had looked up at him. How do you know that? Because I was there when it was written, he said quietly. The weight of that had settled over the room like snow. She had looked at him across the manuscripts and the cold coffee in the distance of 7 centuries, and she had said, Tell me, and he had. Not everything, not that night, but he had begun. And something in the way he spoke about those centuries, not with nostalgia but with a kind of careful honesty that acknowledged both the wonder and the weight of having lived so long, had dismantled something inside Ophelia's considerable emotional defenses. She had been careful after that. She was always careful. She had grown up the only child of parents who treated her primarily as evidence of their own intellectual accomplishments, who had admired her cleverness while remaining consistently uninterested in her as a person, and she had learned early that the safest architecture for a human heart was one built with very thick walls and extremely well-maintained distance. She was warm with people she liked. She was generous with her time and her intelligence. She did not let anyone inside the walls. Balthazar had not climbed the walls. He had not tried to charm them down or argue them into irrelevance. He had simply sat across from her, evening after evening, and been exactly himself, which was terrifying and fascinating and honest, in a way that she had not anticipated from a 400-year-old vampire king. And the walls had developed cracks she could not quite locate. The evening things shifted was not dramatic. There was no grand declaration. They were working as usual, she on a 15th century Venetian codex that had come in for authentication, he reading alongside her from a secondary source she had requested, and she had made a small sound of frustration at a passage that refused to yield its meaning, and he had leaned across the table without announcement to look at the same line, and his shoulder had pressed against hers for 3 seconds before she leaned back. And in those 3 seconds, something passed between them that was nothing like the distance they had been so carefully maintaining. He had straightened. She had not looked up. The silence in the room had been enormous. "Ophelia," he said. "I know," she said. Another silence. Then he said, "I should tell you something. I suspect you should tell me several things. My court does not know about you." She set down her pen. "I see. They know I have been visiting this archive. They do not know why. They do not know that I have been spending these evenings with a human woman. If they did know, they would." He stopped, started again. "There are blood laws. Ancient codes of conduct that govern the relationship between vampires of the court and humans who become aware of our existence. Most of those laws resolve the situation by eliminating the human's awareness, either through erasure or through more permanent means. You did not do either of those things." "No, why not?" He looked at her. It was the most direct look he had ever given her, and it hit with the force of something that had been held back for a considerable time. "Because you said hello?" he said, "and I could not." Ophelia was quiet for a moment, processing the 400 years of political calculation and immortal pride that it had taken for him to say those 3 words, and then she said, "That is going to cause problems, isn't it?" "Yes," he said. "It is going to cause significant problems." She had not kissed him that night. She had not been ready, and more importantly, she had not been impulsive. Because Ophelia Marwood had built her entire adult life on the principle that being not impulsive was a survival strategy of the first order. But she had reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, just long enough for the contact to register, just long enough for him to turn his hand under hers and hold it for a moment that felt like a century. And then she had taken her hand back and said, "Tell me about the blood laws," he had told her. Over the next 2 evenings, sitting in the archive that was becoming a place unto itself, a third space that belonged to neither his world nor hers, he had explained the structure of vampire court law with the precision of someone who had helped write some of it and had lived under all of it. The blood laws were ancient. They predated the formal courts by several centuries, originating in the period when vampires had been hunted to near extinction and had responded by developing codes of secrecy and insularity so rigid that they had calcified into religious obligation. A vampire who formed a lasting bond with a human was considered compromised. A human who knew the court secrets was considered a liability. A king who brought a human into proximity with his court's deepest operations was, according to the oldest texts, subject to censure. "What does censure mean exactly in your context?" Ophelia had asked. "It can mean removal from power," he said. "In extreme cases, it has meant execution. And your court, if they knew about me, would they pursue that?" He had been quiet for a moment. "There are those among my advisors who would see it as an opportunity," he said carefully. "The court has not been unified for some time. There are those who believe I have governed too moderately." He paused, and she had the sense he was choosing words with particular care, too inclined toward accommodation with the human world. They want to return to older ways. How much older? Old enough that the word accommodation would not appear in the vocabulary. She had understood what he was not saying. "You are telling me that your court has a faction that wants to go to war with humanity." "I am telling you," he said, "that my court has a faction that does not believe humanity is worth considering at all." And that was the moment she understood that this was not simply a complicated personal situation. That the evenings in the archive and the manuscripts and the lean of his shoulder against hers were embedded in something vastly larger and considerably more dangerous, and that knowing him, being known by him, was not a private matter but a political one, with consequences that could not be measured in any archive she had ever worked in. She had not walked away. That said everything about who Ophelia Marwood was. Instead, she had said, "Tell me about Lord Varys." Because she had been listening carefully all along, and the name Varys had appeared 3 times in his careful edited accounts of court politics, always in a context that was just slightly too neutral. The way a person says the name of something they are afraid of. Balthazar had looked at her with those pale eyes that she was beginning to read the way she read difficult texts, not by accepting the surface meaning, but by understanding the grammar of what lay beneath. "Varys," he said, "is the head of that faction, and he is actively working against you. He has been for the better part of a century." "What does he want?" "My throne," Balthazar said simply, "and a return to the old compact which would, among other things, authorize predatory hunting of humans at scale rather than the managed and consensual arrangements that currently govern how my people feed." Ophelia sat with that for a moment. So he is not just a political opponent, he is an ideological one. Yes, and he has support in the court. Enough that I cannot simply remove him without creating a civil fracture that would be catastrophic. He leaned back in his chair, and for a moment he looked not like a vampire king, but like a very tired person, carrying a weight that had been on his shoulders for a very long time. "I have been managing the balance for decades. It requires constant attention." "That sounds exhausting," she said. He looked at her. "It is." The intimacy of that admission, so simple, so unguarded, had done more to dismantle Ophelia's remaining caution than any grand gesture could have. She had looked at him across the table and understood that what she felt was not infatuation, and not danger-adjacent excitement, though there was certainly some of that present, but something considerably more serious, something that recognized him. It was the following evening, 2 days before everything shattered, that he had kissed her. They had been leaving the archive together, which had been happening increasingly as his visits extended later and later into the night. And they had stopped in the narrow corridor at the foot of the stairs. And he had looked at her in the dim light, with an expression she was only beginning to learn to read. And then he had reached up and touched her face with one cool hand, and kissed her with a careful intensity that suggested it was something he had been thinking about for quite some time, and was determined to do correctly. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not exploratory or uncertain. It was the kiss of someone who had decided, and had committed entirely to that decision. And Ophelia had kissed him back with equal conviction and felt the walls she had spent 28 years building come apart with a thoroughness that should have frightened her, and instead felt profoundly, specifically correct. When they separated, he had kept his hand against her jaw and looked at her with something naked in his expression, something that 400 years of immortal pride had not been enough to hide. "This is dangerous," he said. "I know," she said. "For you particularly. I know that too," she said. "I have read the text you left me. I understand the blood law implications." "Ophelia, I am not afraid of the implications," she said. "I am afraid of making a decision based on fear rather than truth. And the truth is that I have been falling in love with you since the second evening you sat across from me and told me that the secondary encoding used the ecclesiastical calendar because you were there when it was written." She paused. "So, what are we going to do about it?" He had kissed her again in answer, and it was a better answer than anything he could have said with words. The next day, everything fell apart. Balthazar had come to the archive earlier than usual. Not in the evening, but in the small hours, which she knew was unusual because vampires, contrary to the most dramatic popular mythology, could tolerate some daylight but avoided the hours of direct sun, and the archive's basement had no windows, which made it safe. He had appeared at the back door with blood on his jacket and a controlled expression that was doing insufficient work to mask what was underneath. "Something has happened," Ophelia said. "Varys moved sooner than I expected," he said. "He has presented a formal accusation to the inner council. He claims that I have been sharing court secrets with a human informant, which he frames as a violation of the blood law on disclosure. Is it true? He looked at her. I have not shared court secrets. I have had personal conversations. The distinction matters under the law, but Varys is arguing that the act of sustained contact with a human, repeated and concealed from the court, constitutes disclosure by conduct, regardless of content. And the inner council is divided, which is worse than having them unified against me, because it means the situation will not resolve quickly. It means it will escalate. He sat down, still in the jacket with the blood on it, and pressed his fingers together and looked at the work table. He has also issued what amounts to an ultimatum. Either I present myself to the full court within 48 hours to face a formal inquiry, or he will call for an emergency convening on grounds of the king's incapacity. And which is worse? The inquiry I can manage, potentially. The emergency convening would allow him to appoint a regent during the proceeding, which would give him enough procedural leverage to accomplish everything else he wants. Ophelia was already thinking. She could feel the specific quality of focus that came when a problem presented itself in full, all its complexity visible, all its variables live. So you need to present yourself to the full court, yes. But if I do that, they will immediately demand to question everyone connected to the alleged disclosure, including you. That is fine. It is not fine, he said, with more heat than she had ever heard from him, the controlled voice breaking slightly on the word. Ophelia, you do not understand what that room is. 300 vampires of the old blood, half of them looking for an excuse to demonstrate that humans cannot be trusted with any proximity to the court, and Varys with a prepared case, and the motivation to use you as a weapon against me. You would be in that room without any protection that the law actually recognizes. I would have you, she said. You would have me in a room where my ability to act on your behalf is legally constrained by the proceeding itself, he said. If Varys moves against you during the inquiry, I cannot simply... He stopped, jaw tight. I cannot simply remove the threat, not without violating the conduct rules of the proceeding, which would be used as evidence of my guilt. Then we need to make sure Varys' case fails on its own merits, Ophelia said, which means I need to understand exactly what he is alleging, and exactly what the evidentiary standards are under blood law, and whether there is anything in the historical precedent that could work in your favor. This is not an archival problem, he said. No, she said, but it has archival solutions. Every legal code has a history. Every law has a written record of how it was intended to be applied. If the blood law on disclosure was written as a protection against active sharing of dangerous intelligence, not against personal relationship, then the argument Varys is making depends on an expansion of the original intent. I can find that. Give me the texts. He had looked at her for a long moment, and in that look was something she recognized as the specific collision of his desire to protect her from this, and his understanding that she was not someone who could be protected from things by exclusion. You are remarkable, he said quietly. I am thorough, she said, which in this case is more useful. The texts, Balthazar. He had given her access that night, not to the archive upstairs, but to his own records, the documents he's kept in a vault beneath his London residence. And she had spent the better part of 2 days in those rooms reading blood law texts that were older than the English language, cross-referencing precedents, and reading commentaries in Latin and Lombardic, and 2 languages that had no modern name. And she had built a case. She had also found something else, something she had not been looking for, and that once found, explained the blood on his jacket, and the timeline of Varys' sudden escalation with a clarity that made her go very still at the reading table for quite some time. There was a compound, an alchemical preparation, not magic in the supernatural sense, but in the older sense of applied chemical knowledge, that had been sophisticated in the 12th century, and had simply never been documented in human scientific literature, because the beings who possessed the knowledge had spent considerable effort ensuring that human scientific literature remained ignorant of them. The preparation was specifically designed for use against a vampire of the old blood. It did not kill, it was cleverer than that. It attacked the vampire's own immune regeneration, the specific mechanism that made old blood vampires nearly impossible to harm through conventional means, turning it against itself, creating a slow metabolic collapse that mimicked natural incapacity. It was, in short, the perfect political weapon for someone who needed the king incapacitated, but needed that incapacitation to look natural enough to justify an emergency convening, and Ophelia had found, buried in a margin notation, in a text she had not been looking for, the reversal. It was simple, which was almost insulting, given the complexity of the preparation itself. A specific mineral compound, available in the modern world under its chemical name, though the text described it by its medieval alchemical designation, administered in a solution with two other components that were equally mundane and equally available. She had written it down. She had put it in her pocket, and she had gone to find Balthazar to tell him what she had found, only to discover that during the 48 hours she had spent in his vault, Lord Varys had moved considerably faster than anyone had anticipated. He was not there. He was not in the residence. And when she had finally reached Petra on the phone, Petra's voice had been very careful and very frightened in a way that told her everything she needed to know before Petra said the words. They took him this morning. The inner council. Varys presented emergency evidence of incapacity, and the council invoked the convening protocol. They have him in the court chamber. Ophelia, he is very ill. Whatever Varys gave him. I know what it is, Ophelia said. And I know how to reverse it. I need to get into that chamber. That is not a safe thing to want, Petra. How long does he have if I do not? A silence, then a day, maybe less. Then tell me how to get into that chamber. And that was how Ophelia Marwood, with a written formula in her jacket pocket and a mineral compound and two supporting chemicals in a small vial that she had synthesized in 3 hours in a borrowed laboratory, had walked into the hidden court beneath London and confronted 300 vampires of the old blood and a steward with a silver blade. She had known she might not walk out. She had gone anyway. The blade was still at her throat, and Mordecai was still speaking to the assembled court in that smooth, dismissive voice. And Ophelia had approximately 90 seconds before the situation deteriorated, past the point where her intervention could save anyone. She could feel the cool silver edge against her pulse point with an intimacy that she absolutely refused to allow to dominate her awareness. You want to hear the irony, she said, loud enough to carry. The law you are using to justify this, the blood law on human disclosure, was written in the 9th century by a court scholar named Uldric of Moravia. I have read the original text, not a translation. The original in his hand with his marginal notes. Mordecai's eyes flickered. It was slight, barely perceptible, but Ophelia was very good at reading texts, and she read it. The law specifies disclosure of strategic intelligence, she continued. It defines strategic intelligence in Section 4 as information pertaining to court locations, blood supply arrangements, political alliances, and military capacity. It does not include personal conversation. It does not include romantic attachment. And it specifically excludes, in a marginalia that Uldric added after a case he apparently found embarrassing, any situation in which the human in question is acting in service of the court's protection. You are not acting in service of this court, Mordecai said. I am here to save your king, Ophelia said, which means I am acting in service of this court whether you like it or not. And I suggest you take that blade away from my throat before Lord Varys makes it considerably worse for you when this is over. From somewhere to her left, a voice said, Let her go, Mordecai. The voice was low and rough, nothing like the controlled clarity she was accustomed to, hoarsened by whatever the preparation had done to him. But it was unmistakably his, and it changed the air in the room, the way a change in atmospheric pressure changes the feeling before a storm. She turned her head despite the blade. He was at the far end of the chamber, seated on the throne that dominated the room's far wall, which under other circumstances would have been appropriate and regal and exactly right, but which now had the quality of a prop barely sustaining a performance. He was white-faced even by vampire standards. The cool ivory of his skin gone to something that looked like paper held up to light, and his hands were gripping the arms of the throne with a force that suggested it was holding him up rather than the other way around. But his eyes were clear, pale grey and absolutely clear, fixed on Mordecai with an expression that 4 centuries of sovereign authority had made into something that did not need volume to communicate its meaning. Let her go, Balthazar said again, and step away from her. Mordecai, to his credit, tried. "Your Majesty, the woman is—" "Let her go," Balthazar said. And this time the three words came out with the specific weight of someone who has made a very final and very irrevocable decision. And even Mordecai, who was not a small creature in any sense, moved backward. The blade left Ophelia's throat. She walked toward the throne. She was aware of every vampire in the room watching her, aware of Varys somewhere, to her right making sounds of legal objection. Aware of Petra at the entrance to the chamber doing something that from the corner of her eye looked like it involved blocking the doors. She walked across the obsidian floor in the iron manacles, with her head up, and her spine straight, and her eyes on the man at the end of the room, who was watching her come toward him with an expression that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. She reached the dais. She was close enough to see the effort it cost him to hold himself upright, the precise and terrible discipline of a king who was dying by careful chemical design and refusing to let anyone in this room see him fall. "I have something for you," she said quietly. "You walked into this room with 300 vampires and a man with a blade to bring me medicine," he said. His voice was low and only for her. "I also walked in with a legal argument that I believe invalidates the entire basis of Varys's accusation," she said. "But yes, also medicine." She held up the vial. "It will taste unpleasant." "How unpleasant?" "I synthesized it from memory in a borrowed laboratory in under 3 hours," she said. "So probably quite unpleasant, but it will work." He looked at her. The chamber was ringing with noise now, Varys shouting objections. Other voices responding. The accumulated political tension of decades finding its moment of rupture, and in the middle of all of it, Balthazar reached out and took the vial from her hand and held her fingers for a moment before he released them. "How did you find the reversal?" he said. "It was in a margin notation in an X that was miscatalogued in your own vault," she said. "Whoever filed it did not understand what they were looking at." "Of course they did not," he said. "It has been sitting there for 800 years unread." "Everything waits to be read by the right person," she said. He drank the vial's contents with his eyes fixed on hers, and she watched him process whatever it tasted like, which, from his expression, was every bit as unpleasant as she had predicted. And then she watched him breathe, and gradually, over perhaps 2 minutes, watched the terrible paper pallor of his skin shift towards something less alarming. "Varys," Balthazar said. His voice had recovered something of its normal quality. He did not raise it. He did not need to. The room quieted with a speed that was almost comical. "Come here." Varys was a tall vampire, older looking than most of the court, in the way that very old vampires occasionally resolved their years into visible gravity, with a severe, angular face and white hair cut close, and the kind of contained fury of someone who has watched a carefully constructed plan come apart from an unexpected direction. He moved toward the throne with the gait of a person who was calculating options and finding none of them satisfactory. "You have violated the compact," Balthazar said. "You have administered a preparation against the king's person. You have manufactured false evidence for a legal proceeding. You have used the inner council as an instrument of a private political ambition. And you have threatened a person under my protection." "Under your protection," Varys said, and his voice had a bitter edge. "She is a human. She has no standing in this court. The protection provisions of the compact do not apply to humans in general," Balthazar said. "No, they do not. But they apply to someone who has just acted in explicit service of the court, which, by the compact's own definition, makes her court adjacent, and they apply absolutely to someone who is under my personal recognition, which I am extending formally, now in front of this court." He paused. "You studied the law, Varys. You know what personal recognition by the sovereign means." The room went very quiet. Ophelia did not know precisely what personal recognition by the sovereign meant, but she could read the reaction of 300 vampires and well enough to understand that it was significant. "You cannot," Varys said. "I can," Balthazar said, "and I have. Do you want to pursue the argument further, in full view of this court, knowing what it will reveal about your activities of the past 6 months?" The silence stretched, and then Varys, with the specific rigidity of a creature that has lost and knows it, and is enduring that knowledge with whatever remained of its dignity, stepped back. The inquiry that followed took 3 hours. Ophelia sat to the right of the throne, and was questioned by 7 members of the inner councils. And she answered every question with the precision and care she brought to every difficult text. And she cited the Aldrich of Moravia Marginalia 4 times, and the blood law precedents from the 9th and 11th centuries twice. And she watched the faces of the assembled court shift, slowly, and with the resistance of entities for whom change was genuinely difficult, from suspicion to something more complicated. She was not naive enough to think she had won everyone over. 300 vampires of the old blood did not become comfortable with human involvement in their court in an afternoon, but she had demonstrated, in front of all of them, that she understood their laws better than some of them did, that she had used that understanding to protect rather than threaten, and that she had walked into their most sacred chamber in iron manacles with a vial of medicine and an argument, rather than a weapon or a silence. That meant something. She could feel it meaning something. In the room's gradual change of temperature, Varys was formally censured, stripped of his seat on the inner council, and placed under a restricted compact pending a full investigation into his activities and his use of the preparation against the king. Several of his allies withdrew their association from him with a speed that said everything about the difference between ideological conviction and personal loyalty. 2 of them approached Balthazar afterward with expressions of careful political re-evaluation that Ophelia suspected he would find useful later. It was late, very late, well past midnight, when the chamber finally emptied enough for Balthazar to rise from the throne and walk toward her, and she noticed that he walked without the tightness of the preparation's effect, and with most of his usual quality of controlled, unhurried authority returning. Not entirely. He was still recovering. But enough. He stopped in front of her. Someone had removed the manacles some time ago, and she had rubbed the marks on her wrists without thinking about it, and he reached out and took both her wrists and looked at the marks for a moment with an expression that was not controlled at all. "Does it hurt?" He said. No, she said. He raised his eyes to her face. "When I heard you speak, when I heard your voice from across that chamber, before I even understood what was happening." He stopped. "You do not have to explain," she said. "I want to," he said. "I want to tell you that hearing your voice in that room, knowing you had come there, was the most frightening thing I have experienced in 400 years, and also the most," he paused again, looking for the word, "the most extraordinary. I was not going to leave you to die in a political trap," she said. "That was never going to be an option I would choose." "You could have been killed," she said. "You were being killed, slowly and carefully, by someone who thought your attachment to me was a weakness. I wanted to demonstrate that it is not." "Was that the only reason you came?" he said. She looked at him. "You know it was not." He brought her wrists to his lips briefly, a gesture that had nothing performative about it. Was just the press of his mouth against the marks and the warmth she had not expected from someone so cool in temperature. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about the personal recognition I extended. I assumed you would explain it. Under the compact personal recognition by the sovereign means." He paused, and for the first time in all their evenings together she saw him uncertain about something, genuinely uncertain, searching her face rather than the floor or the middle distance. "It means placing you under the full protections of the compact as if you were a member of the court. It means acknowledging you formally before the entire court as someone who matters to me in a personal and non-political capacity. Which," another pause, "which, given the blood laws, and given what the court has just witnessed, will be interpreted as a permanent declaration of intent." "A declaration of what intent, specifically?" she said quietly. "That I intend to keep you near me," he said. "That you are not temporary, that whatever this is," he looked at their joined hands, "is not something I have any intention of ending or diminishing or concealing." Ophelia was quiet for a moment. The vast chamber around them was empty now, or nearly, the obsidian floor reflecting the low lights, the high ceiling lost in shadow, and the only sounds were the ambient hum of the city somewhere above them, and the very specific, very present sound of him breathing, which she had learned to notice because she found it reassuring. Proof of continuation. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have been thinking about what we are and where this goes and what it means for someone of a mortal lifespan to be with someone who is not. And I have been thinking about it with a great deal of care. Not because I am looking for reasons to step back, but because I do not make significant decisions impulsively, and I find the permanence of this less frightening than the alternative. The alternative being, he said. Not having this, she said simply. Not having you. He pulled her in then, not urgently but inevitably, and she pressed her forehead against his jaw and felt the cool certainty of him around her. His arms and his chest and the anchor of his presence, that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and that she now understood was specific to him, was not supernatural glamour or predatory attraction, but him, the particular gravitational weight of a person who had decided, and decided completely, and was standing by that decision. I should also tell you, she said against his jaw, that your vault has a significant miscataloguing problem in the pre-11th century section. Several extremely important texts have been filed under completely wrong dates. A sound came from him that she had heard only twice before and cherished both times, low and brief, and entirely genuine. Of course they have, he said. I am terrible at filing. You are 400 years old, she said. How are you terrible at filing? I am 400 years old and I have always had people to file things for me, he said. Until recently I had no reason to correct this. And now, he said, I have you. The following weeks were not quiet. The Dunraven Court did not become a place of simple welcome and easy accommodation overnight, and Ophelia had not expected it to. She was a human in a vampire court, the first in living memory who had not been there in a servant or subject capacity, and that was strange enough to generate friction without any additional provocation. There were vampires on the inner council who looked at her with the particular wariness of creatures who had survived by treating novelty as a threat. There were younger court members who watched her with undisguised fascination. There was Mordecai, who had enough political survival instinct to be unfailingly correct in his treatment of her, while making his lack of enthusiasm entirely apparent. She did not try to win all of them. She was not naive enough to think that was possible, or patient enough to make it her project. What she did was continue to be herself, which meant being thorough, which meant that when the inner council became aware that the woman under the king's personal recognition was an expert in pre-modern European manuscripts, and that their own vault had significant archival problems, there was a gradual and somewhat reluctant acknowledgement that her presence could serve practical purposes beyond the purely personal. The practical purposes became a project. The project became a role. Not a formal court position, not initially, but a functional one, which in Ophelia's experience was often more real than the formal one anyway. She still kept her position at the archive in Holborn, because she was not ready to let it go, and because there was value in the connection between the two worlds she moved between, and because she genuinely loved the work, and because Balthazar had been clear from the beginning that whatever shape their life together took, it would not be a shape that required her to diminish herself to fit into it. That was one of the things she had learned about him over months of living in the complicated overlap between his world and hers. He was dominant and protective in a way that was entirely natural to his nature and his history, in a way that sometimes made the air around him feel pressurized with contained authority. But he had never, not once, directed that authority at her as a form of control. He had directed it at threats, at situations, at people who approached her with intentions that his 4 centuries of experience had made him very good at identifying. He had placed himself between her and danger with a speed and completeness that suggested it was entirely instinctive. He had argued sometimes, when she chose paths that frightened him, argued with the specific frustration of someone who knew arguing was useless but could not try. But he had never required her to be less than she was. He had never treated her intelligence as a challenge to his authority or her independence as a problem to be managed. He had, if anything, seemed to find both things about her deeply interesting, in the same way he found the manuscripts interesting. Not in spite of their complexity, but because of it. It was 4 months after the night of the court inquiry. On an evening in early spring, when the city outside was doing the thing it does in a March, where it cannot decide between winter and warmth and alternates every 20 minutes, that they were in the archive together again. As they were several evenings a week, and she was working on a text, and he was reading in the chair across from her, and the room had the quality that it had accumulated over months, The specific warmth of a space that knows it belongs to particular people. She had set down her pen and looked at him and said, "I want to talk about the future." He lowered his book. His pale eyes were attentive and without defense. "I have been reading," she said, "about the old compact. There are provisions I have found that were dormant, not abolished, but not active. A classification called the Bound Accord, which was the mechanism by which a human who had come formally integrated into the court was protected not just for their lifetime, but—" She paused, choosing her words. "The compact has a procedure, a formal integration process. If a human chooses it and the sovereign chooses it, and it is ratified by the inner council, the human is recognized under all the same protections and standing as a vampire of the compact for the duration of their association. It does not change them biologically. It does not change what they are, but it changes their standing under the law in ways that would matter." He was very still. "I know the Bound Accord," he said. "You have been thinking about it too." "Yes. And, he said. "I have not raised it because I did not want to be the one to raise it. Because I am aware of the weight of what it means, and because I am aware that you are mortal, and because I did not want to be the person who—" He stopped, and the controls slipped slightly, and underneath it she could see everything that centuries of careful compartmentalization had been containing. "I did not want you to feel that I was asking you to bind yourself to a world that is not entirely yours because I wanted you to. I wanted it to be a choice. It is a choice," she said. "I am making it right now, telling you I am considering it. I am not asking you to decide for me. I am asking you to make the same decision I am making, which is to acknowledge that this is permanent, that we are choosing this, and that I want all the protections and standing that the compact can offer, because I intend to be in this court for the rest of my life, and I would like to stop being technically anomalous while I am doing it." He stood up. It was not a dramatic movement, but it had the weight of one. The weight of a creature who had spent 400 years in careful motion committing to something different. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her and cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness that still surprised her every time, because it was so at odds with everything else about him. "The Bound Accord requires a declaration before the full court," he said. "Another assembly, another room full of vampires who are still deciding what to make of you." "I have been in that room before," she said. "I think they know what to make of me by now." He looked at her for a moment, with something in his expression that she had learned to recognize over months as the specific look he had when he was feeling something he did not have language for, because 400 years of sovereign isolation did not cultivate the vocabulary for the particular experience of being known completely by someone, and finding it not diminishing but expanding. "I love you," he said. It came out simply, without ceremony, the way the most certain things always do. "I have been in love with you since the second evening you sat across from me, and told me the secondary encoding used the ecclesiastical calendar because you were there when it was written." She laughed, because she had said almost exactly the same thing to him, months ago in a dim corridor, and she watched his expression do the thing she loved, the shift from severe to something that was entirely his and not available to anyone else. "I love you," she said. "Since the same moment, probably. I was just slower to admit it." He kissed her, there in the archive that had become a third world entirely. Among the manuscripts and the cold coffee, and the narrow shelves and the breathing of the old building. He kissed her with the thoroughness of someone who had been doing it for several months, and had no intention of stopping. And she kissed him back with the same conviction she had brought to every decision she had made about him. The formal declaration before the Dunraven Court took place. 3 weeks later, on a night in late spring when the city above was full of the specific extravagance of May, and the chamber below was lit with more ceremony than Ophelia had seen in it before. Long pale candles in ancient iron holders, and the full assembly of the court in formal attire, which collectively was rather overwhelming, in the way that 300 immortal beings dressed for ceremony tended to be overwhelming. She had worn something she had chosen herself, a deep charcoal dress that was neither performing submission nor making an aggressive point, just her own aesthetic, which she had always tended toward the quietly formal. She had worn her hair up because she had wanted to, and she had not worn the iron manacles. Balthazar had been waiting at the center of the chamber when she walked in from the entrance with Petra beside her, and the sight of him in full formal dress, the dark brocade and the silver chain of office, and the white hair in its severe, careful arrangement, had done something to her chest that she suspected would never become ordinary, no matter how many years she was given. He had held out his hand. She had taken it. They had stood before the inner council and made the declaration together. His voice steady as mountains, hers clear and unafraid, and she had watched the faces of the assembled court in the moment of ratification with the same attention she brought to difficult texts, reading the room the way she read a manuscript that was not yet fully yielding its meaning. Not everyone was entirely comfortable. She had not expected them to be. But the room had something in it that the last assembly had not, which was the memory of what she had done, of the woman who had walked in with iron on her wrists and a vial in her pocket and a legal argument in her voice. And that memory was doing work she did not need to do herself. Mordecai, to her complete and genuine surprise, had voted in favor. He had not done it warmly. He had done it with the expression of someone who has looked at a situation from every angle and concluded that pragmatism serves better than sentiment, which was frankly a more honest motivation than several of the other votes she had received. And she had decided in that moment that she could work with Mordecai. When the ratification was complete and the formal words had been spoken, and Balthazar had raised their joined hands in the gesture that the compact described as the acknowledgement of union, something happened in the chamber that she had not anticipated. Not applause, vampires of the old blood did not applaud, but a sound that she could only describe as a shift. 300 entities simultaneously releasing something they had been holding, and in that release a kind of collective recognition that what they were witnessing was not a political complication or a blood law violation, but something much older and much simpler. A choice. Two people choosing each other in full view of everyone who had tried to make that choice impossible. After, when the chamber had returned to something more ordinary and the formal proceedings had dissolved into the kind of careful social maneuvering that Ophelia was becoming well acquainted with, Balthazar had kept her hand, which he tended to do in situations where the court was around them, less from possessiveness than from the specific communication of his presence beside her, the quiet broadcast of his position and hers relative to anything that might consider approaching with difficult intentions. She had told him once that she did not need the physical signaling. He had said that he was aware she did not need it, that it was for him. She had let him keep holding her hand. They stood together at the edge of the chamber as the evening wound down, and she was watching the last of the conversations, reading the political temperature of the room the way she now did automatically, cataloguing what she would need to think about and what she could leave, when he leaned close and said very quietly, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "When I came back to the archive the second evening," he said, "I had not planned to. I had told myself that the situation was resolved, that you had agreed to discretion, that there was no reason to return. I stood outside the building for 11 minutes before I went in." She looked at him. 11 minutes. "I counted," he said. "I was making a decision." "And the decision was?" "That I was going to go in," he said. "And whatever happened after that, I was going to let happen." She thought about the first evening, when she had walked into the basement and found him, and the second evening when he had come back, and every evening after that, the accumulated weight of all of it that had led, through a great deal of complexity and danger and discovery, to this room and this moment and the bound accord sealed before 300 witnesses. "That was a good decision," she said. "It was the best decision I have made in 400 years, he said. "And I have made some genuinely excellent decisions." She looked up at him with an expression she did not moderate, because there was no one in this room that she needed to perform for, and no wall left standing that required maintenance. And she felt him read her expression the way he had learned to. All the way through to the part she did not say out loud, and his grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I want to go home," she said. "Yes," he said. "Let us go home." The London residence, the one that had a basement full of miscatalogued manuscripts and a kitchen that was, over Ophelia's patient campaign, becoming increasingly functional, and a library on the second floor that was in the process of becoming organized according to a proper archival system, and rooms that were accumulating the particular texture of two people's lives overlaid on each other, was quiet and warm when they arrived. She had been bringing things, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily over months. The way water slowly fills a space, a reference library section here, and a particular lamp there, and a set of coffee equipment that she had strong opinions about. And the residents had changed in the way that spaces change, when they are genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied. He had watched the accumulation without comment, which was its own kind of comment, and one evening she had come in to find that he had cleared an entire section of the second-floor library to make space for her reference materials, with shelves rebuilt to accommodate the depth of large-format manuscripts, and a reading table positioned near the window in the way she had mentioned once, weeks before, that she preferred. And she had stood in the doorway of that room for a moment with something in her chest that was too large for the available vocabulary. She had found him in the study, and she had not said anything, just walked in and kissed him once, firmly, and then sat down across from him and picked up the book she had been reading the previous evening, which he had marked her place in. That was the thing. She had realized somewhere in the middle of all of it. That was what had dismantled the last wall, the last careful architecture of managed distance. Not the grand declarations or the dramatic moments, though those had mattered too. It was the small things. The place marked in the book. The coffee equipment installed in the kitchen without announcement. The 11 minutes outside the archive before he came in, it was the fact that he had spent 400 years becoming who he was, powerful and ancient and sovereign, and then he had met her in a basement and come back the next evening because he had decided to let things happen. And what had happened was that two very different people with very different natures and very different lifespans had found in each other something neither of them had known they were missing. On the night of the bound accord, lying on the window seat in the library, because she liked it, and he would sit beside her and she could see the city lights through the glass and the night sky beyond them, and the whole of the enormous dark world at a comfortable distance, she said. "Do you ever worry about the time?" "What aspect of it?" he said. She was lying with her head against him, and she felt rather than heard the low register of his voice. "I am mortal," she said. "I will age, you will not. I am aware," he said quietly. "I have looked into the question," she said. "I have read everything in the vault that touches on it. I am not going to pretend there is an easy answer, or ask you to pretend that. But I want to talk about it honestly, because I do not want the fact of it to become something we do not discuss." He was quiet for a moment. "There are things in the old compact," he said carefully, "that were not included in the bound accord, because the bound accord is about standing and protection, not about nature. But there are older texts that describe choices that were made in very specific circumstances. I have not raised them because I do not want you to feel pressured," she said. "Yes, I have read those texts," she said. He went very still. "I have been sitting with the question for 2 months," she said. "Not because I am frightened of the answer, but because I believe in sitting with important questions until I understand them properly. And I think I understand it properly now." She paused. "I do not want to lose this in 40 years. I do not want to leave you here, and I do not want to watch you carry that." And the text on the voluntary compact of continuation was very specific about the requirement that the choice must be made freely, without coercion, in full understanding of what it means, which I have. "Ophelia," he said, and her name in his voice had the quality it always did, weighted with everything he found it difficult to say directly. "I would not ask this of you. I know," she said. "I am not doing it because you asked. I am doing it because I have considered every option and every alternative and every consequence, and the one I want is the one where I stay with you." She lifted her head to look at him. "That is enough reason. Surely for someone who understands ancient law and deliberate choice, that is sufficient foundation." He looked at her for a long time. In his pale eyes she could see 400 years of a life that had been sovereign and capable, and she understood now, profoundly alone, and the specific quality of a creature who had stopped believing that kind of aloneness would ever resolve, and had then been presented with evidence to the contrary. "There are things that would need to be done," he said quietly. "It is not simple, I know. I have read the complete procedure." "Of course you have." "I want to," she said. "Not as a concession, not out of fear of the alternative. Because I love you and I want the time to be indefinite, and I am choosing this the same way I chose, to walk into that chamber with a vial in my pocket. Completely and without hesitation." He pulled her close and held her with a care that was entirely specific to her, the particular gentleness that existed inside the force of him, that she had been the first person in a very long time to find. She held him back with equal conviction. "All right," he said against her hair. "We will do it properly, with time and preparation and every precaution, and only when you are entirely certain." "I am entirely certain now," she said, "but I appreciate the patience." "I have been practicing patience for 400 years, he said. "I am very good at it." She smiled against his shoulder. Outside the window the city went on, its million-lit windows and its constant human movement and its noise and its beauty, the living world in all its ordinary, extraordinary particularity. And in the library that had been reorganized to hold two people's work side by side, she lay in the arms of someone who had been standing outside an archive 11 minutes making a decision, and thought about how the smallest choices are sometimes the ones that change everything. The vault was fully catalogued by the following autumn. Ophelia had done it herself, with Silas's help and Petra's occasional input and Balthazar's presence, which was often more useful for its quality of focused attention than for any specific contribution he made, though he was better at the work than he had initially let on, which she had suspected, and he had eventually admitted. The Aldrich of Moravia text that she had cited in the chamber was given a proper housing and a proper entry in the reference system, cross-indexed against all the relevant blood law commentary and the precedents she had identified. She had written a formal annotation for it, not in any academic journal that human scholars would read, but in the Compact's own internal records, a clear and complete explication of the marginalia and what it meant for how the disclosure law had always been intended to function. Mordecai had read the annotation and told her, without warmth but with unmistakable precision, that it was the most useful piece of legal scholarship the court's records had contained in several centuries. She had thanked him with equal precision, and they had looked at each other with the understanding of two people who were never going to be friends and were going to make excellent professional colleagues. Lord Varys's investigation had turned up evidence of several additional violations, including unauthorized communication with rival courts and the deliberate destruction of compact records that contradicted his legal arguments. His censure had become permanent removal from court standing. He was alive because Balthazar governed by a code that did not move to execution except in extreme circumstances. But he was no longer a factor in the politics of the court, and the faction he had led had, without his specific energy, largely dissolved into the general body of court opinion. There were still those in the court who were uncertain about Ophelia's place in it. There were still those who watched her with the caution of entities for whom novelty was inherently suspicious. She had not won everyone. She had decided she did not need to. What she had needed, and what she had, was this: the library with its properly organized shelves. The mornings when he was already in the study when she came down, reading something 800 years old with the attention of someone for whom 800 years is a personal rather than a historical distance. The evenings in the archive in Holborn, where the old building still breathed around them and the manuscripts still spread between them like bridges. The quiet certainty of being known by someone completely and finding that knowledge not diminishing but carrying. She was in the library one evening in December, 6 months after the bound accord, when he came in with 2 cups of coffee, which was still something she found quietly remarkable, a vampire king, learning to operate coffee equipment for the sake of her morning routine, and set one down beside her work and sat across from her, with his own cup and his current book, and the room had the quality it always had. She had looked up at him over the manuscript she was examining, and he had looked back over his book, and no words were necessary, because the room said everything, and the coffees said everything, and the 4 months it had taken her to trust him completely said everything, And the night she had walked into the chamber said everything, and all of it together made a language that was entirely specific to the two of them, built from choice and trust and danger and discovery, ancient and entirely new. "Thank you," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "For the coffee?" "For coming back the second evening," she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when something landed deeper than words could immediately reach. "Thank you," he said, "for saying hello." Outside the library, the December city was full of light and movement, and the ordinary, extraordinary business of human life going on in all its varied complexity. Inside, in a room full of properly catalogued manuscripts and two people's work set side by side, Ophelia Marwood and Balthazar Dunraven sat together in the warm quiet of a life they had built from a decision and a wrong turn and a door that should not have existed. And the story of how the court thought the human was powerless settled into its true shape at last. She had not been powerless. She had never been powerless. She had simply been the right person, in the right archive, at the right moment, with enough courage to say hello and enough thoroughness to mean everything that came after. And he had been the one who came back. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.